Hello, hello. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our second installment of our Grand Fête de Bourgogne. We are very pleased to have you here joining us again for another great dive into the depths of Burgundy. I, of course, am John Capon, the owner of Acker Maryland Condon, America's oldest wine shop, the world's largest wine auction house. I'm joined by our own wine and food superstar, Lily Mirabelle Friedman. Welcome, Lily.
Nice to see you, John. Glad to be back on Wednesday.
It's a Wednesday and it's the daytime, but it's not daytime in Burgundy. And we are thrilled to be joined by the one and only Erwan Faveli, proprietor and winemaker, does everything and anything to do with Domaine Faveli, one of the most important and storied domains in all of Burgundy. And welcome, Erwan. Thank you for joining us.
That's quite an introduction. Thank you, John. Well, thank you for having me with you today.
Yeah, what would you technically call yourself at Domaine Faveli? Are you a proprietor, owner, winemaker?
Technically, I'm the owner. I took over my father 15 years ago in charge of the domain, so I'm the general manager. And as far as the winemaking is concerned, we have a winemaker here, a head winemaker that's with whom I work pretty much every day. But still, so yeah, general manager, owner, but still quite involved, very involved in all the technical part as well.
Right. Well, thank you. Welcome. Of course, you're you're the seventh generation, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Domain.
Yes. I wouldn't say I am. I would say we are, because I have two siblings. My brother doesn't work with me, but my sister joined me in 2014. So today we are running the winery between my sister and I.
And where are you right now? I mean, is that in Nuits Saint-Georges, correct?
Yeah, because my house. So I'm at the winery, 38 Rue du Tribourg in Nuits Saint-Georges, and my the family home is 20 numbers up in the street. So it took me 3 minutes to walk down to the winery. You see? So yeah, I'm in Nuits Saint-Georges.
You don't have to drink and drive home. That's good. We don't want to be responsible for anything. So
that's the plan. That's the plan. That's why we build a winery right next door.
Right. So just as a reminder to everybody tuning in, thanks for joining. If you have any questions for Erwan, please just join us in the chat and make sure to select all attendees and panelists. This way everybody will get to see the chat, and we'll try to bring everything online. So first, we'd like to start with some big news outside of Burgundy. Newsflash, you just purchased William Salem, one of the most storied and respected producers of Pinot Noir in California. Tell us about it.
Okay, you went a little too far. We haven't purchased William Salem. In fact, I've been looking very much into getting back in the US. I'm a big fan of the US. I've always loved the wines, loved the people, loved the place, and for over a decade, just like many French and European winemakers, I wanted to have a base in the US. So I've looked for nearly a decade. I narrowed, of course. I was interested only in Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, because I'm not so sure I'm legitimate to do Cabs or Merlot, etc. So I was looking for some Pinots and Chards. So I narrowed, of course, to Oregon, California, mostly. Of course, there are some other places, but this is really where I narrowed my search. And very soon, there were three main places that I was looking at: Santa Barbara, Santa Cruz, and Russian River. And when I heard that William Salem, a friend introduced me to John Dyson, the owner of William Salem, an amazing man, extremely knowledgeable about wine, about vine, etc. There was a very strong fit. So we agreed that I would buy a minority at William Salem to give us 3 years to work together and for him to see if we would be the right future tenant, the right the right people to take over him. So we have, and if everything happened as planned, which I hope, and I think which John hopes, then yes, with hopefully in a few years from now, we would get the majority of William Salem. So super exciting. I'm extremely excited about this adventure. As I said, it's a decade long of looking for. I think we found the greatest fit. We were talking a little earlier with Lily and her experience with William Salem. I think it's getting joining Fevele. Yeah, no, not synergy, but joining Fevele and William Salem. I think is something that makes so much sense. I mean, so yeah, it's an exciting piece of news indeed.
Well, it's pretty much, you know, the Pinot Noir producer with, I think, the greatest reputation in California, and you of course, you know, have one of the greatest reputations in all of Burgundy. So it does seem like a great marriage. You know, what's interesting to me is that everybody in Burgundy seems to be Oregon. So why California for you?
As I said, you know, I really looked at Oregon, and Oregon was very much on our list. Now, you know, when you're talking about, I'm absolutely not saying that California is better than Oregon. That would be nonsense. I think the two wine regions have their strength and their personality. I really think Russian River makes extraordinary Pinots and also Chards, just like Oregon. It's just two different styles. We could have gone to Oregon, of course, but I say I'm a big fan of Russian River wines. Huge fan of William Salem. So yeah, the fit was good.
Right. Well, that's great. We're excited to see. And are you going to be? What's your involvement as far as the winemaking, or how are you going to be involved with the?
So for the first 3 years, I will be really looking at what's going on. My plan is to visit there a few times a year, spending many weeks there, looking at vineyards, meeting people, getting to know deeper the region and the company. So far I haven't planned to go and settle in California. It could have been a dream when I was 30, but unfortunately now I doubt it would be feasible to just go there for a few years. Maybe, who knows? It will be more a personal and family decision. But no, as far as so far it will be really making sure the team knows that we are behind them, that we support what they do. Of course, if I can be involved in defining a little bit the style and putting some new ideas, I'll be very thrilled. But you know, William Salem has made tremendous wines. They have not waited for us to make extraordinary wines. So I certainly don't pretend to go there and change anything. You know, when I see how amazing this winery is, as I say, it will be very pretentious to tell them what to do. And that's absolutely not my plan. And that's not the way I am, basically, neither as a person.
Right. So the rumors that you invested in William Salem so you could go surfing more, they're not true.
Well, I would have bought something in Maui, but you know, I've never found some great vineyards on Maui, you know.
Right. Okay. We're excited to see what you're going to do, and it's very exciting to see. I'm a big fan of California Pinot Noirs. I actually drink California Pinot Noirs, you know, kind of at home when I'm drinking by myself. I just love a lot of them, the juicy, as long as the alcohol doesn't get too high. We know that can be an issue in California. But you know, I love them. So I'm excited to see what you're going to do. But let's talk about Fably a little bit here. That's what we're here for, the Grand Fête de Bourgogne. And so when did you start at the domain? Was it always going to be, you knew you were going to work at the domain, or you kind of were finding your
No,
way, or?
no. So the story was that I've always been pretty I've always been a good student at school. You know, never made. I was. Some say I was not the most popular guy at school. I'm not sure about that. But basically, I love school and I was pretty good in maths. So you know, when you're good in maths in France, basically you just you progress, etc. So I thought at some point I would become engineer. I caressed at some point I studied math, physics a lot. At some point I caressed the idea of becoming astrophysicist. But it seems that I was not clever enough to work in astrophysics, and you know back then an experience that really struck me when I turned 18. My parents threw a surprise party with all my friends. So I went home one night, and one night all my friends were there. And as you know, in 18, you're legal to drink. So my father handed me the keys of the cellar, and said, you know, now tonight drink, of course, reasonably, but the cellar is yours. But if I may, you should really take a look at this batch of wine. The wine is very special, and I'm pretty sure you like it. And we drank that wine all night, and that was the Latricière 1993. One of the, and you know, it struck me that wine has followed me ever since. So I still have roughly 60 bottles of each. I pop one bottle every one and then one every year, pretty much. So I hope if I pop one every year, I'll be able to become to push to 100 years old if I'm lucky. But that wine, I'm telling you, and I'm sure you know that, because you know, as a company specialized in auction, 93, that was not a great vintage back then when it was released. Today, 93 is one of the hottest vintage for Burgundy out there. And the moment I drank that wine, and that was back in 97, that Latricière 93 back in 97 was out of this world. And ever since, I haven't tasted many wines that were to this quality. And you know, when I tasted that wine, I said, making wine is not a bad idea. And then then from that moment, it became pretty clear that I would take over my father. I didn't plan to take over him as soon as I did. I took over him, I was 25. I wanted to get some more experience. I went to work in the US. I worked in finance. Didn't really enjoy the finance world. And then, so when I was 25, my father offered me to join him. Not only to join him, but to take over him. And as we say in French, you know, when a train stops, either you jump on it or you just let it go. So I jumped.
Wow, nice. Well, I mean, I think that you've really brought a lot of innovation and a lot of, you know, I think the quality of the wine since you've jumped on that train, it just keep getting better and better and better and better. They've always been good, but you know, I really love what you're doing. And on that note, let's try some wine here. We got 4 wines to get through, and we're going to start with a little bit of white. I know you had some white earlier in the night, but we'll have some the Clos Rochette 2018. And now you own this property since 1930.
Yes, we have, you know, in Mercurey. Mercurey is, as you know, Mercurey is part of the Côte Chalonnaise region. Côte Chalonnaise region is right below the Côte de Beaune.
Right.
And my family has been involved in that wine region for a long time now, because we signed a lease on vineyards back in early 1910s. We found those vineyards, we made the wines out of them, and in the early 60s, late 50s, early 60s, we had the opportunity to buy this property that we were farming. We also bought a lot of wood that were around the vineyards. We planted those woods. We created. We increased our holdings in Mercurey, but also in Reuilly, and later on in Givry and Montagny. But our idea was that already back then, at the beginning of the century, the wines of Côte de Nuits and Côte de Beaune were already quite pricey. And back in the Côte Chalonnaise, down in the Côte Chalonnaise, you would find some great values. And that's really what drove my great-grandfather to sign lease there. That's what drove my grandfather to buy the property. That's what brought my father to deforest and to plant vineyards. And today, we have nearly 70 hectares in Mercurey, in white, in red. And I think that the wines we produce there are a crazy good value, because the wines are fresh, are crispy. They are maybe not as complex as the Côte de Nuits or Côte de Beaune, but for what they are, they truly stands out.
Well, the song kind of remains the same. You said they were great value, many decades ago, and today, I mean, the Côte de Beaune, Côte de Nuits, the wines have gotten a lot more valuable, and deservedly so. And the Côte Chalonnaise, I mean, is still where the real value in Burgundy is. I mean, you even have a separate winery, a separate facility to make the wines. It's a very important, and the whole Côte Chalonnaise is very important to your company.
Oh, no. So when I said in the early 60s we bought the property, the beauty of it is that it's we have the winery, but we have the winery, and the vineyards are very close to that winery. So I have a team there that of course that works in the vineyards. The wine is made there. The wine is vinified there. The wine is fine there. So all the barrels are there. We only bring back the wines of Mercurey at the moment of bottling, because bottling is really a very special operation, and you'd be surprised how if the bottling is not well made, you can ruin the work of 18 months. And therefore, I much prefer having the wines brought back in Nuits Saint-Georges and to bottle the wine in a state-of-the-art facility, to make sure that the wine we get is that at least the bottling won't impact badly the wine. Well, the bottling will never make a wine better. It will just it can only make the wine worse. And the bottling is a very, very, very important moments in the wine in a wine's life.
Well, that's a very big deal. I mean, that's a lot of barrels to be moving about 65 kilometers. But
it's but when if the barrels are topped off, there's not much going on them. They just arrive here in Nuits Saint-Georges.
Rate of trucks, is it 18-wheelers and 18-wheelers coming in for bottling day? I mean, it seems like it would be a lot of barrels.
No, not so much. Not so much. 70. If you think about it, 70 hectares. 70 hectares, roughly. I would say. I would say 15 barrels. 15 barrels per hectare. Alors no. Not all the barrels, of course, not all of them goes through barrels. I would say down in Mercurey, we have roughly around a little less than 400 barrels, which to move is not much of an issue.
Wow, that's amazing. So I never heard about that moving, the bottling, and that's very interesting to me. Well, this I think. I think it retails for what, Lily? What's the price of the Mercury?
$38. And I think this wine is so spectacular in the fact that it still has, at this price, still has just a kiss of reduction, has just a hint of oak. I know there's a little bit of oak on this wine, yeah? And it's just so delicious and fresh. Even from riper vintage like 18, it's impressive every time.
Alors, no, no, you know what's interesting is when you're talking about reduction. I think it's strangely enough that's not our signature.
No.
I'm not a big at the domain. We are not working on reduction for the white is not is not our signature, and this reduction is really coming from the terroir. And the terroir, you know, this name Clos Rochette is coming from small rocks that are actually, if you go in the vineyard, there are many tiny rocks that does I would say it doesn't look at all like Chablis, but in the spirit you'll get this the Clos Rochette. If you compare the Clos Rochette to all the other white wines that we produce in Côte Chalonnaise, the Clos Rochette has this almost Chablis touch. Not in the iodic characteristic, but in this reduction character that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And I'm a big fan of this wine. And I'm not the only one, because it's you know, it's a sizable vineyard, more than 5 hectares, and yet every year, and we are talking about the village wine, we are on allocation every year on this for this wine. It's crazy.
Yeah,
It's
you
crazy.
say sizable 5 hectares. How many cases does that translate for?
So that's so I would say that's roughly, I would say out of Clos Rochette we would make around 30,000 bottles. So that's what 20 to
2,500. Yeah.
2,500
Yeah.
cases.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, I mean, that's still a small amount when you think about this price point. I mean, that's not a lot of wine to go around. I mean, this is pretty much as good a white Burgundy as you can buy for $40 a bottle. I mean, it really doesn't get any better. I don't think I can't think of one that's any better, you know, and so it's a great value, and you know, so a wine that you can drink any day of the week, anytime. You could drink it, you know, at 3:30 in the afternoon, right, Lily?
Yeah.
No, of course, you know, it depends on your financial means. There are people out there where whose money is not an issue, and that would pop some Montrachet and Corton Charlemagne every day. But the vast majority of people are not like this. And it's true that if you're really looking for a great wine at this in this price range, I would say $30-40. I think it's a great catch.
Yeah, yeah. We have some interesting comments. Sid says hi from Vancouver. He had a great 85 Latrissiere for Christmas.
Big time.
Year.
Awesome. I had the Mazzy 85 for Christmas. Awesome.
Yeah.
Such a good vintage.
Yeah, and we have a couple of interesting questions. One about the architecture there, and then one about the winemaking.
So someone is curious if it's a glass ceiling building, but I don't think so. I think it's just the lights pointing up, right?
No, alors, but I can take you around.
Sure. All
If
right.
you, yeah,
Sure,
if so here, so we are in Nuits Saint-Georges, and this is where as I said, this is where my family is based, and here this is the winery where we now vinify all the top wines, all the Grand Crus and most Premier Crus. So we renovated that place in 2018, and unfortunately, alors, so it's only wood and stone. The big glass door that you saw is right here behind me, and if I open it, you won't see much, but something interesting you could see maybe is right below me. You see this little So that's the Chateau Gris. It's a little pretty house in the middle of the vineyard that is now lit every night. It's very pretty, but yeah, if it was daylight, you would see just 10 yards behind me. It's full of vineyards. It's pretty sweet. You should really come and check it out. It's
right.
You should really come and check it out.
It's a beautiful visit. It's and the cellar where you have all
and right below my Oh, yeah, but so that was what I was about to say. You know, right below my feet are some amazing cellars, huge cellars. But unfortunately, I cannot bring you there because the Wi-Fi is not working. So yeah, I'd rather keep you with me.
Thank you. John, do we want to start getting into kind of the changes that Erwan's implemented in terms of the winemaking?
Yeah, I think we had a great question there, you know, about the expressiveness and approachability over the past 10 or 15 years, and a question about what changes have you made in the winemaking since you've assumed control of the domain? That came from the question.
Great question. Great question. So, you know, when I took over my father, my father had a very personal style. He loved wines that were very structured. He's a big fan of Côte du Rhône, of Bordeaux, and I believe also, on the contrary, my grandfather was making wines that were very light, very perfumed but very light. And I think that he wanted to take he wanted to make a stand versus his own father. And when I took over my father, I think I pretty much did the same. If my father has always loved big and tannic wines, I wanted to go in a more lighter, perfumed, and also velvety touch in my wine. So what I did basically, for the first 2 years, I made sure that every week I would visit a winemaker in the neighborhood, and you'd be very surprised how welcoming most winemakers were. So I visited dozens and dozens and dozens of winemakers, not only, but first to see exactly what style I wanted to do and what those winemakers were doing, what they were doing versus what we were doing, and what we had to change to get into the style I wanted. And it appeared there were two things that needed to be changed: things in the vineyards and things at the winery. The easiest to change is at the winery, because changing something in the vineyards takes years and years and years. But the very first thing that we changed in 2007 at the winery was very much coming back to gravity. To gravity. You know, my father has always been one of he was always ahead of his time in terms of innovation. He was one of the first, if not the first, to implement a sorting table in Burgundy. And back in 89 and in the 89 and 1990 vintage, those two vintages were pretty warm, and it was a little and back then it became quite not fashionable, but in the enologist, in the winemaking world, people were getting obsessed about perfume and obsessed about cold maceration. And in order to do cold maceration, he went to Italy. He bought a system, an Italian system, to cool down the harvest when the harvest would come at the winery. It came as a big pipe. It was a heat exchanger, so we would, of course, harvest everything by hand. We would sort all the grapes at the winery, and then those grapes would be then pumped into this heat exchanger, this pipe, in order to be cooled down, to do this cool maceration. And it was extremely powerful, it worked very well. The issue we had is that when the harvest would come out of this pipe from a nice, clean, hand-picked berries, what would because of the pressure in the pipe, what would come out of the pipe would be crushed berries, and it had a huge impact on the vinification. Why? Because when a berry is crushed, all the sugar is available for the yeast to be consumed, and therefore, when the fermentation would start, it would be extremely complicated, if not impossible, to control the vinification, to control the temperature, and to control the cinetic of vinification. And by stopping using this, by feeding by gravity the vats, and we didn't redesign. It was not. We didn't redesign the place gravity it was just we just had buckets that we just dumped with a forklift, where we would just dump the salted grapes in the vats with a forklift. And just by doing this, of course, investing into a cooling system for each vat, which was quite expensive, a few million euros. But by doing this, investing a few million euros, we were able to have a much better control on our vinification curve, on our temperature curve, not going as high, being able to keep the temperature very low, having longer maceration, and therefore quite some extraction, but at lower temperature with less alcohol, meaning less tannins. And really the profile of our wines totally switched when we moved back to gravity in 2007. Then we made many other improvements. We changed the way we press also the must at the end of vinification. We went back to using a vertical press. We changed a little. We changed also our barrel makers with whom we were. But those were, I would say, those were fine tuning. Tuning in minute details, but the big change was really coming back to gravity. And then so that was about the vinification of the winery, but we also changed many things in the vineyards, things that I'd be very happy to talk about, but that was it took much more years to arrive. And earlier on, when we were discussing, John, I said that 2007 was really when we totally changed our approach of vinification. And for me, 2012, and I'm very happy we will taste the Corton 12. For me, 2012 was the first vintage where I told myself, wow, if I had to do that vintage again, I'm not so sure I would do something differently.
Interesting. Well, we'll get to the 2012. First, let's get to the 2017. We have some Gevrey Chambertin Vieilles Vignes. Now, do you make a Gevrey and a Vieilles Vignes, or is it all Gevrey Vieilles Vignes, or there are two?
We do. In fact, when we bought, the story behind the Gevrey Vieilles Vignes is that back in 2014, I bought a pretty nice, quite large domain in Gevrey called Dupont-Tisserandot. Yeah. And Dupont-Tisserandot was based in Gevrey. Dupont-Tisserandot was 20 hectares, wow. The vast majority being in Gevrey. And out of those 20 hectares, nearly 8 hectares were Gevrey village. Pieces, many small pieces scattered all over the village, right? And therefore today, with former Faivelet, with Faivelet, the historical Faivelet plots and the Dupont-Tisserandot plots, today we have nearly 10 hectares of village, and therefore for us it was impossible to make 20 different Gevrey based on the terroirs. So we've decided to create one Vieilles Vignes and to blend the best plots together to make one Gevrey Vieilles Vignes that would only be sold with Faivelet, and the plots that would not be granted the Vieilles Vignes, the quality that we believe should be called Vieilles Vignes, would be either sold in bulk to some of the negociants, or sold in another brand that we own called Marquis de Villerange, that you would never encounter because it's for other markets. So the idea was really in that wine to put the greatest cuvées that we can make or could make every year.
And for you, what is Vieilles Vignes? Is there a law label Vieilles Vignes a certain age, or you determine it yourself?
You know, there are the only thing, strangely enough, the only thing that you can, as soon as your vineyard is over 7 years old, strangely enough, you are allowed to call it vieille vigne.
What?
So
No
vieille
way.
vigne, yeah,
Really?
very few people know that. Very
Yeah.
few people know that. So therefore, you know, for us, vieille vigne was and this is why that we decided to call it vieille vigne, because for people, vieille vigne means old vines and therefore great quality wines. But for us, it's not so much about the quality, the age of the vines, because you can have some old vines that make crappy wines.
Right.
You can have some young vines that can make extraordinary wines. Right. And therefore, for us, we decided to call it vieille vigne because, of course, all of them are more than 7 years old, but not. It's not the question of so much old. It's really that we want the people to know that when they get this wine,
the best
the
person.
quality,
Right.
it is, but there are no way to say Gevrey Chambertin, our best plots, you know. So for us, it's Gevrey Chambertin, our best plots, and it's vieille vigne because
right.
people know that it should be right. Great, and I believe it's great.
But that's interesting. I mean, I'm surprised we don't see a lot more misuse of the term vieille vigne, because for me, I don't feel like this is a misuse, but like, you know, you would, but I guess there seems to be, you know, a general respect amongst Burgundy, you know.
I thought it's exactly what you said. You know, we when we decided to do that, it took us when we decided to do that. In fact, we our concept, our philosophy was that if we put vieille vigne, the wine should be super good. We cannot make a Gevrey vieille vigne average. The Gevrey vieille vigne has to be extraordinary. And I think this is why a lot of I'm pretty sure that the reason why you don't see vieille vigne that much is that if you put vieille vigne on your wine and your wine is not to the standard of what people expect of a vieille vigne, then shame on you.
Well, this is great. I mean, you know, this is, I mean, not only is it great, the price is fantastic too. Again, like this is something we sell for $60 in the US, and you cannot, it's difficult. There's a lot of bad Burgundy out there for this price. And you know, and I think that this is delicious. And 2017, of course, I think that's a vintage that lends itself to drinking well early. Talk to us a little bit about 17, 18, 19, the vintages that are coming to the market right now and that are in the market.
We are in the golden age of Burgundy. You know, since if you look at the second half of the decade, of this decade, it's been extraordinary. We've had 15, then after 15, I thought it was impossible to make a better vintage. Then came 16, extraordinary, better than in my sense, better than 15. Then came 17.
Different styles.
Very different style, of course, but still, I still have a sweet spot for 16. Then came 17, and you know, 17, if it's not, it's not as ripe or as hype as 15 or 16. To be frankly honest, for the next 5 years to come, when people will come, visitors and friends and customers will come and visit us in Nuits Saint-Georges, when we will host dinners and lunches, etc., I can tell you that the vintage we will pop won't be 15, 16, or 18 or 19, it will be 17, because the 17s to drink for the 5 years to come, it's extraordinary.
Yep.
People who love 2007, it's a 2007 plus. It's a 2007 with more with more depth, more flesh, and God knows how much I love the 07s. Yeah. The 07s was a crazy good vintage. Yeah. Then came 18, and you know, since 18, 19, and too soon to talk about 2020. we will see. We'll have plenty of time to talk about 2020 come on next autumn. But I can tell you that 18 was extraordinary. 19 was, I think, is even better. I don't know if you saw that article on the Financial Times, but they said it could be the greatest vintage since 1865, 19. And I've never tasted 1865, but I've tasted I've tasted the 19, and I have to agree, it is one hell of a vintage.
Wow.
It's extraordinary, extraordinary. The reds are stellar. The whites are not so much of my taste. The whites are good. They are extremely rare. The volumes made for whites is we've done roughly a third of a classic vintage, so they are very few. It's not so much my style. They will sell very well because they are very commercial. They are plum. They are very pretty. Once again, not my style, but the reds, spectacular. Wow. And the 20s. I don't want to tease you too much, but it's something. It's something that's coming. I'm telling you.
It's like, I know that's like a cliffhanger, though. You know, it's like we're like, it's like tune in next year for the finale of the. You have to wait for the.
Oh, but you know, come on. Once again, different than 18, different than 19. But a very interesting personality, you know, fresher than strangely enough, because, you know, 2020 was if you look at the weather, it was the warmest year that we've ever had, warmer than 18, than 19, and yet the wines are fresher than those two vintages, which is very strange.
Not warmer than 03, no, not that warm.
Almost.
Okay.
But you know, we've picked coming back to 03 in 2020, we picked earlier than 2003. So the ripeness was there, but with the ripeness, the wines are not too alcoholic, not at all. Strangely enough, the freshness is there. The aromatic is brilliant. So you'll see. It's going to be. It's really going to be something.
All right, sounds good. Well, before we move into the Grand Crus and start to taste some of those, I want to talk about some of the family history. Now, the domain is named Joseph Faiveley, but he was the second Faiveley.
Yes.
Right? Not the Pierre was the first.
Alors Pierre was the first, and so
is the name of the domain.
I think he named. Pierre was the first. Joseph was born in 1825, and Pierre was born Joseph was born in 1823, and when Joseph created the company, or when registered the company. Okay. He registered the company under the name of his son. Just, I guess, you know, just like I think it's something quite classic in the wine world to name a lot of winemakers have named one cuvée after their children, or one vineyard after their children, etc. And I think this is what Pierre. It's not what I think. It's what Pierre Faiveley did, naming his company after the name of his newborn son.
Right. Okay. Very cool. Well, that makes sense. You've answered the question. And then your great grandfather, Georges, was one of the founders of the Confrérie de Chevalier d'Estaing. And I heard a story that they formed the Testament because they needed to empty the barrels and drink all this wine because the barrels were worth more than the wine. Is that true?
Oh yeah. It's a crazy story. It sounds like another. It sounds like another world. But yeah, no. But back, when the big 29 crisis crossed the Atlantic and came to France, it had a huge impact. The worst impact is it created. This is what created the Second World War, basically. But back in the early 30s, the economic crisis in France, in Europe was huge, in France was huge, and in Burgundy it translated as the fact that nobody was buying wine anymore. So all the domains, all the negotiations here were seeing their cellars piling up with wine that nobody would drink. And in fact, my great grandfather Georges, alongside his friend Camille Rodier, had this idea, saying that the idea at the beginning was really that we are going to die. There's not much we can do, and since we could have died. He fought at Verdun in the First World War, so he saw he knew what death meant. So he said, dying for dying, let's invite our friends and drink our cellars down, and at least we'll enjoy ourselves before getting laid down. And that worked extremely well. Also, Georges Feydelet had, and I've never really known the why, but he had friends everywhere, and very famous, very powerful friends. He was extremely he was very close to the American ambassador in Paris. He was very close with a lot of journalists in Paris. So he invited a lot of his friends, but he also invited those well-known guys, saying, we are going to throw a party, but it will be super upscale. I want you to write down speeches that are state of the art. We are going to drink wine, but we are going to drink them in the proper way. And that's what they done. It worked extremely well. People loved the party. It was incredible. And 80 years later, from that idea, 80 years later, the Confrérie now is a 20,000 member compagnonnage, association.
Yeah, group.
Yeah. Crazy story.
I
wish I had known. I wish I had known Georges, because Georges was beyond in life. He was out of the 7 generations. Georges was the yeah.
I think
I have the same haircut. I have the same haircut as him, though.
Yeah, he sounds like he was the chief drinking officer of the domain, perhaps.
Yeah, big time.
Well, it's so let's talk about the 2018 now. Latrissière 2018. I know you have some with you. Talk to us about 2018. Latrissière, we know, has a special place in your heart. The first wine you were allowed to drink from the cellar at the domain, and I think a lot of collectors feel that this is like the insider's wine in the portfolio. So tell us about Latrissière.
It's always been one of my favorite wine at the domain. Latrissière is not the most well-known Grand Cru in Gevrey, and I still wonder why, because its direct neighbor is Chambertin, so it's the greatest Grand Cru, touching the greatest Grand Cru. The soil of Latrissière is very close, if not almost the same as Chambertin. I would say the difference between Latrissière and Chambertin is that Latrissière is in a combe, meaning that you have as you know, in Burgundy you have it's a succession of small hills, and between each hill, this is where the wind will blow, and usually we call it a combe, the space between 2 hills, and this is where wind blows, and usually a combe is a place that is cooler than in other places, and therefore but those are cooler places, and La Tricière is definitely cooler than the Chambertin because of this Combe proximity. And in fact, that maybe with global warming, the fact that this Combe is there and get this fresh air floating on the La Tricière, something that was a disadvantage back in the days, today is really becoming an asset for this Grand Cru. And I think that it's been many years that really the La Tricière is becoming one of it's always in the top 5 or in the top 3 greatest wines that we do at the domain. It's extremely consistent. Maybe also, it could also be linked to the quality of the Pinots that were planted there, maybe. But it's true that when I see the consistency of quality in La Tricière, I'm very surprised why La Tricière is not more. As you said, it was back in the day. Today, most of the market knows that the La Tricière is really one of our signature wine.
And the 18 is I can see I mean, I haven't had too many 18s. This is one of the first ones I've had, actually. A lot of richness, and you can feel the volume of the wine. This is almost a wine that you feel like, oh, I should have opened it up in the morning, at 9 a.m. to be ready. So I'm almost looking forward to this wine tomorrow and the day after, because I'll put a cork in, I'll put it in the refrigerator, and then I'll take another glass tomorrow.
I agree.
The next
day. I agree, but I would say even even further that it's a wine that you should have popped a year ago, because when it was 1 year old, just after bottling, the 18s were superb. The fruit was extraordinary. Now the 18 is slowly shutting down. Alors, it's not shut down yet, but contrary to what it was last year and now, you can feel, and this is why I can say it's a very serious vintage, because now you can feel the wine needs to get himself back together. Right. So of course it's always interesting. It's always interesting to taste a wine young, but I would really, more than I would highly suggest, is really for the 18, and especially for the top 18s, the Grand Crus and the best Premier Crus. Open one if you want, just for the sake of the curiosity. Curiosity, but wait at least a decade, and I'm telling you, in a decade from now, the 18s will be stellar.
Yeah, or do a village wine, or
or do a village wine.
Right. If you want to try a Grand Cru, early 17 is definitely the way to go. 100% agree with you. And but there's no doubting the raw material. I think we had a couple of questions about another terroir, and we have somebody who wants to work for you. And then also, why don't you take us into Clos de Courton as well, Lily?
So we'll start by just asking your comparison. You spoke about the Combe going through La Tricière. How would you compare La Tricière to Mazy-Chambertin?
There could not be two different wines. But first, if you look at the geography of Gevrey-Chambertin, La Tricière is the further south, Mazy is the further north of Grand Cru. So the distance between them is the highest you can find between two Grand Crus. And the soil, in terms of exposure, in terms of altitude, it's exactly the same. It's very much in terms of the soil. The soil, in fact, if you look at the soil, there has been a geological map made of Gevrey by the village of Gevrey, and if you look at the soil is very similar between Latricière, Chambertin, Chambertin Claude Bèze, Ruchotte. It's quite similar. And then really at the end of Ruchotte, there's the soil changes drastically, and you're in the Mazie. And it translates very much in the wine. And you know, at the domain, we are lucky to have 4 Grands Crus in Gevrey. We have Latricière, we have Claude de Bèze, we have Mazie, and we have Charme Chambertin. And it's true that if you look at Latricière, Claude Bèze, and Charme, they are siblings, very much. The Mazie is even not a cousin. It's really something different.
Different
The
family.
wine is, yeah, the wine is. There's almost a kind of bloody character. No, I believe they are. I would not be surprised. You have some iron in the soil because the blood tastes a little bit iron, and in fact it's a character that I find very, very often in the Mazie that is never there in the 3 others. If you have the chance to find the geological map of Gevrey, just plug on Google Gevrey Chambertin geological map. I'm pretty sure it will pop out. It will pop up. Take a look. It's fascinating. And even more fascinating is that the Cazetier, which is a premier cru that we own, where we have quite a few hectares. The soil of Cazetier is not that different as the one from the Grand Crus that I was talking about, Latricière, Chambertin, etc. Take a look. It's fascinating.
My next question is going to be about the winemaking itself, which we didn't really touch on. We talked about a little bit when you were talking about gravity and the changes that you made when you came in 2005. But someone asked, for which wines are you hand removing the stems and keeping the pedicles on the grape? It seems this is being done more in Burgundy recently, as we know, given how much labor it involves. Curious if you've seen that this has a big impact on your wines, or is it still too early to tell?
Alors, it has a huge impact. My father was destemming everything except the Musigny. And so since I took over in 2005, I've been experimenting for 15 years. And I came to the conclusion. Alors, I never like to draw definite conclusion because I think winemaking is always an ongoing journey of experiences. But out of those 15 years of experience, I realized that whole bunch is quite terroir linked, meaning that the Chambol Musigny, for example, putting some whole bunch in the winemaking in Chambol makes great wine. In Vosne Romanée too, even though Vosne Romanée, we have only a piece of Échezeaux, but if you look at all the great growers of Vosne Romanée, whether it's La Romanée-Conti being the most famous, they are known for using whole bunches. On the contrary, Corton, and talking about Diancy is a good example. You know that now Diancy has a Corton. The first few vintages of Diancy, when they use Corton, 09 for example, they vinify Corton. Maybe I'm wrong, but I get the impression they vinify the Corton in the same way as they would vinify their Vosne Romanée Grand Cru, and it's not working. It's the Corton. All the experiments we've done ourselves on our plot of Corton were always disappointing. So for me, Corton, Pommard, it's a no-go. Volnay on another hand, we have a tiny plot in Volnay called Volnay-Fremier. Whenever we've used the whole stems, the wine was great. So I think Volnay works well. Gevrey-Chambertin, we came to the conclusion that it's not a place for a whole cluster. And to be honest, I'd be surprised if you can name someone in Gevrey who would use whole cluster. Not many, very few, very few. So you see, for me, it's very much terroir oriented. And then out of this came your own judgment. So, so drawing a conclusion out of this, yes, we use whole cluster in Chambolle-Musigny, in Échezeaux, in Clos-Vougeot, in a few of our plots in Mercurey, and years after years, when we feel like it, we do some new experiment. We re-experiment, but those re-experiments shows us that it's always better distant.
Perfect. Well, the last question I'll give, and it'll be the perfect transition into the 2012 Corton. Sid in Vancouver is curious about the ageability of the Clos de Corton. He had a killer 1978 last month, but also had the 1990 recently and felt it still a bit austere. So where does the ageability land for the Clos de Corton? And we're going to jump into the 2012.
Alors, 1990, I came to the. I'm slowly coming to the conclusion that 1990 might not be the greatest, the great vintage that everybody thought. 78 was known as a great vintage, and I think it's the greatest vintage of the 70s period. So yeah, I'm not surprised. The Corton 78 is superb. And as far as the ageability is concerned, I wish you could have seen this, but 3 years ago, I was invited by some friends in Atlanta, and they managed to gather. Alors, I wouldn't recall the exact number, but they gathered a lot of old Clos de Corton. They asked me whether I would be happy to join them to taste them, and if we had some further vintages. So, and I had a few. If I remember correctly, the oldest we've had was 1923 until the most recent. We gathered 40 or so different vintages, and it ages very well, of course. Great vintages better than small vintages, but what's for sure is that it's for us not only in terms. For me, it's not so much a question of ageability. It ages just like every great Burgundies. But what is very spectacular about Clos de Corton is just like La Trissière. It's the consistency. It's a very consistent. It's a very consistent vineyard. Great vintage and not so great vintage. You know the wine will deliver big time. And you know, even 2004, and God knows I'm not a big fan of 2004, the Clos de Corton Fèveley in 2004 was better than expected, to put it that way.
Well, this is amazing. I mean, this is really like, it's been in your family since 1873. It's been a monopole since 1874, and it's one of two Grand Crus, two wines in all of Burgundy that the monopole has the family name, and the other is Visconti. And I didn't even know that until just yesterday. And so it says here, Clos de Corton Fèveley. That's actually part of the monopole. So how did that happen?
Alors, it's an interesting story. Alors, I'll try to make it short. As you said, we bought that plot in 1873, and we were sold that plot under the name Clos de Corton. On the paper we signed with the seller, it stated as Clos de Corton. And as you know, a clos in Burgundy means a vineyard that is closed by a wall. And Corton, as you know, is the name of a hill between Nuit Saint-Georges and Beaune, very famous hill, magical hill, where everything that is planted makes spectacular wines. And so we bought that plot in 1873, and in 1935, when Burgundy decided to do its classification between Grand Cru, Premier Cru, etc., the way it was organized was that every village should make their own classification and should make a proposition of their classification to a commission, to a higher commission that would say yes, no, etc. And well, during this classification, the owner, all the people that own plots on Corton came to see my great-grandfather and said, we would like you to stop using that name because you're not the only one to have a clos on the hill of Corton. So it's misleading for the consumer. So you should go back to the name Rognier Corton. Of course, we didn't agree. So we went to court. We won. They appealed. We won again. And since it had been judged twice and that both parties were quite stubborn, it went in front of the Cour de Cassation, which is pretty much the equivalent of the Supreme Court in the US. So yeah, we take wine things pretty seriously in Burgundy. So it went in front of the Cour de Cassation, and the Cour de Cassation said, true, Fèvlet is misleading the consumer using this name, Clos des Cortons, because they are not the only one to have a clos. On another hand, Fèvlet is in good faith because they were sold that plot 60 years ago under that name, and they have been producing and selling that wine ever since. So in order to please everybody, that name could all still be called Clos des Cortons, provided that it's been called Clos des Cortons Fèvlet.
Nice.
So he said, we didn't ask for so much. We didn't ask for so much, but because of this decision, today we are, just like you said, Romanée Conti was a plot of La Romanée bought by the Prince of Conti. The family of the Conti family disappeared, and we are the only living family who has a Grand Cru named after us.
Wow.
Thanks to that.
That's a great story. Amazing story. And this is an amazing one. 2012. I was just telling you beforehand when we were talking, I haven't had too many 2012s because I've always felt they're just not ready. They're not ready. They're not ready. This one's starting to get ready. What's your experience with 2012?
I'm a big fan of 12. I'm a big fan of 12 because it's a very classic Burgundy vintage, peaked mid-September. The concentration of 12 is very high. It was amongst the lowest yields that we've done, and therefore the wines are concentrated, classic. I'm not. They are not ready yet to be opened. I think they are still in this close period. But if you ask me where I would rank 2012 in the past vintages that we've done, it would be very high. It would be very high. It's not as rich or as warm as could be 15, 16.
Right, but
for the people who have a taste of Burgundy that has some acidity and some acidity and some freshness, I think 12 is a very, very interesting vintage.
Yeah. I mean, that's what it is. And this is why, this is a delicious wine. This is the first 12 I've had in a long time where I'm like, wow, okay, now I can enjoy it. And I think your Clos des Cortons Fèvlet is actually, for a Grand Cru wine, I mean, I don't know if you could find a better Grand Cru, for the price and the quality and the value and everything. I mean, it's an extraordinary wine. And anybody who's watching here that haven't tried one, you need to get moving, get busy, get to work and get some bottles. And, Erwan, thank you so much. I know it's late in Burgundy. This has been an amazing
No, it's such a pleasure.
You are an amazing ambassador for all of Burgundy. You continue your family tradition in the highest honors category. And I can't wait to see you again, either in New York or Burgundy, or both. And
thank you, John. And likewise, you're an amazing ambassador for our. I know you love Burgundy. I know that's your sweet spot. So thank you for being such an ambassador. Thank you, Lily, for organizing this event. It was a pleasure, and I really hope to see both of you, as you said, whether in Nuits Saint-Georges or in New York. And also for all the people who are behind their screens, who had the opportunity to see this, please let us know whenever you're in Burgundy. let us know. If you can get the opportunity to visit us, it would be with big pleasure.
Right.
You're welcome.
And Erwan will get you a special visa from the French consulate. You could come next.
please. I can't wait. I can't wait. I didn't marry an American girl, so I'm stuck. I want to go back to the US. So
Hey,
please help.
California, here you come, you know.
Bah, en tout cas, take care. Thank you so much for organizing this. John, you take care. Lily, à bientôt. And all of you behind your screens, thank you for watching this. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. We'll be back tomorrow.
À bientôt. Bye bye.